Freedom of the press or freedom of the media is the freedom of communication and expression through mediums including various electronic media and published materials. While such freedom mostly implies the absence of interference from an overreaching state, its preservation may be sought through constitutional or other legal protections. With respect to governmental information, any government may distinguish which materials are public or protected from disclosure to the public based on classification of information as sensitive, classified or secret and being otherwise protected from disclosure due to relevance of the information to protecting the national interest. Many governments are also subject to sunshine laws or freedom of information legislation that are used to define the ambit of national interest. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights states, "Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression." This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference, and impart information and ideas through any media regardless of frontiers. This philosophy is usually accompanied by legislation ensuring various degrees of freedom of scientific research, publishing, press and printing. The depth to which these laws are entrenched in a country's legal system can go as far down as its constitution. The concept of freedom of speech is often covered by the same laws as freedom of the press, thereby giving equal treatment to spoken and published expression. Status of press freedom worldwide. Beyond legal definitions, several non-governmental organizations use other criteria to judge the level of press freedom around the world. Reporters Without Borders considers the number of journalists murdered, expelled or harassed, and the existence of a state monopoly on TV and radio, as well as the existence of censorship and self-censorship in the media, and the overall independence of media as well as the difficulties that foreign reporters may face. The Committee to Protect Journalists uses the tools of journalism to help journalists by tracking press freedom issues through independent research, fact-finding missions, and first-hand contacts in the field, including local working journalists in countries around the world. CPJ shares information on breaking cases with other press freedom organizations worldwide through the International Freedom of Expression Exchange, a global email network. CPJ also tracks journalist deaths and detentions. CPJ staff applies strict criteria for each case. Researchers independently investigate and verify the circumstances behind each death or imprisonment. Freedom House likewise studies the more general political and economic environments of each nation in order to determine whether relationships of dependence exist that limit in practice the level of press freedom that might exist in theory. So the concept of independence of the press is one closely linked with the concept of press freedom. Worldwide Press Freedom Index. Every year, Reporters Without Borders establishes a ranking of countries in terms of their freedom of the press. The Worldwide Press Freedom Index list is based on responses to surveys sent to journalists that are members of partner organizations of the RWB, as well as related specialists such as researchers, jurists and human rights activists. The survey asks questions about direct attacks on journalists and the media as well as other indirect sources of pressure against the free press, such as non-governmental groups. RWB is careful to note that the index only deals with press freedom, and does not measure the quality of journalism. In 2011 and 2012, the countries where press was the most free were Finland, Norway and Germany, followed by Estonia, Netherlands, Austria, Iceland, and Luxembourg. The country with the least degree of press freedom was Eritrea, followed by North Korea, Turkmenistan, Syria, Iran, and China. Freedom of the Press. Freedom of the Press is a yearly report by U.S.-based non-governmental organization Freedom House, measuring the level of freedom and editorial independence enjoyed by the press in every nation and significant disputed territories around the world. Levels of freedom are scored on a scale from 1 to 100. Depending on the basics, the nations are then classified as free, partly free, or not free. In 2009 Iceland, Norway, Finland, Denmark, and Sweden topped the list with North Korea, Turkmenistan, Myanmar, Libya, Eritrea at the bottom. Non-democratic states. According to Reporters Without Borders, more than a third of the world's people live in countries where there is no press freedom. Overwhelmingly, these people live in countries where there is no system of democracy or where there are serious deficiencies in the democratic process. freedom of the press is an extremely problematic problem concept for most non-democratic systems of government since, in the modern age, strict control of access to information is critical to the existence of most non-democratic governments and their associated control systems and security apparatus. To this end, most non-democratic societies employ state-run news organizations to promote the propaganda critical to maintaining an existing political power base and suppress any significant attempts by the media or individual journalists to challenge the approved government line on contentious issues. In such countries, journalists operating on the fringes of what is deemed to be acceptable will very often find themselves the subject of considerable intimidation by agents of the state. This can range from simple threats to their professional careers to death threats, kidnapping, torture, and assassination. Reporters Without Borders reports that, in 2003, 42 journalists lost their lives pursuing their profession and that, in the same year, at least 130 journalists were in prison as a result of their occupational activities. In 2005, 63 journalists and 5 media assistants were killed worldwide. Examples include, the Lira-based Over case in Kazakhstan, the Georgia arts case in Ukraine, in Nepal, Eritrea, and mainland China. Journalists may spend years in jail simply for using the wrong word or photo. Regions closed to foreign reporters: Chechnya, Russia, Agadan, Ethiopia, Jammu and Kashmir, India, Waziristan, Pakistan, Agades, Niger, North Korea, Syria. History: Europe and the United States. Europe has a long tradition of freedom of speech, including freedom of the press. Now, the United States has that, along with the freedom of religion and the freedom to assemble and to petition the government. All of this is stated in the United States First Amendment in the Bill of Rights. After World War II, Hugh Bayley, the president of United Press Wire Service based in the U.S., promoted freedom of news dissemination. In 1966 he called for an open system of news sources and transmission, and minimum of government regulation of the news. His proposals were aired at the Geneva Conference on Freedom of Information in 1948, but were blocked by the Soviets and by France. Denmark Norway. Between September 4, 1770 and October 7, 1771 the Kingdom of Denmark Norway had the most unrestricted freedom of press of any country in Europe. This occurred during the regime of Johann Friedrich Struensee, whose first act was to abolish the old censorship laws. However, due to the great amount of mostly anonymous pamphlets published that was critical and often slanderous towards Struensee's own regime, he reinstated some restrictions regarding the freedom of press a year later, October 7, 1771. United Kingdom. According to the New York Times, Britain has a long tradition of a free, inquisitive press, but, unlike the United States, Britain has no constitutional guarantee of press freedom. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 in England established parliamentary sovereignty over the Crown and, above all, the right of revolution. A major contributor to Western liberal theory was John Locke. Locke argued in 2 treatises of government that the individual placed some of his rights present in the state of nature in trusteeship with the sovereign in return for protection of certain natural individual rights. A social contract was entered into by the people. Until 1694, England had an elaborate system of licensing. The most recent was seen in the Licensing of the Press Act 1662. No publication was allowed without the accompaniment of a government-granted license. 50 years earlier, at a time of civil war, John Milton wrote his pamphlet Areopagitica. In this work Milton argued forcefully against this form of government censorship and parodied the idea, writing, "When as debtors and delinquents may walk abroad without a keeper, but unoffensive books must not stir forth without a visible jailer in their title." Although at the time it did little to halt the practice of licensing, it would be viewed later as significant milestone as one of the most eloquent defenses of press freedom. Milton's central argument was that the individual is capable of using reason and distinguishing right from wrong, good from bad. In order to be able to exercise this ration right, the individual must have unlimited access to the ideas of his fellow men in a free and open encounter. from Milton's writings developed the concept of the open marketplace of ideas, the idea that when people argue against each other, the good arguments will prevail. One form of speech that was widely restricted in England was seditious libel, and laws were in place that made criticising the government a crime. The king was above public criticism and statements critical of the government were forbidden, according to the English Court of the Star Chamber. Truth was not a defence to seditious libel because the goal was to prevent and punish all condemnation of the government. Locke contributed to the lapse of the Licensing Act in 1695, whereupon the press needed no licence. Still, many libels were tried throughout the 18th century, until the Society of the Bill of Rights led by John Horntook and John Wilkes organised a campaign to publish parliamentary debates. This culminated in 3 defeats of the Crown in the 1770 cases of Arman, of Miller and of Woodfall, who all had published one of the letters of Junius, and the unsuccessful arrest of John Wibble in 1771. Thereafter the Crown was much more careful in the application of libel. For example, in the aftermath of the Peterloo massacre, Burdett was convicted, whereas by contrast the Junius affair was over a satire and sarcasm about the non-lethal conduct and policies of government. John Stuart Mill approached the problem of authority versus liberty from the viewpoint of a 19th-century utilitarian. The individual has the right of expressing himself so long as he does not harm other individuals. The good society is one in which the greatest number of persons enjoy the greatest possible amount of happiness. Applying these general principles of liberty to freedom of expression, Mill states that if we silence an opinion, we may silence the truth. The individual freedom of expression is therefore essential to the well-being of society. Miller Unregistered Trademark's application of the general principles of liberty is expressed in his book On Liberty. If all mankind -1, were of one opinion, and one, and only one person were of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person, than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind. Italy. After the Italian unification in 1861, the Albertine Statute of 1848 was adopted as the constitution of the Kingdom of Italy. The statute granted the freedom of the press with some restrictions in case of abuses and in religious matters, as stated in Article 28, the press shall be free, but the law may suppress abuses of this freedom. However, Bibles, catechisms, liturgical and prayer books shall not be printed without the prior permission of the bishop. After the abolition of the monarchy in 1946 and the abrogation of the statute in 1948, the Constitution of the Republic of Italy guarantees the freedom of the press, as stated in Article 21, paragraphs 2 and 3, the press may not be subjected to any authorization or censorship. Seizure may be permitted only by judicial order stating the reason and only for offences expressly determined by the law on the press or in case of violation of the obligation to identify the persons responsible for such offences. The Constitution allows the warrantless confiscation of periodicals in cases of absolute urgency, when the judiciary cannot timely intervene, on the condition that a judicial validation must be obtained within 24 hours. Article 21 also gives restrictions against those publications considered offensive by public morality, as stated in paragraph 6, publications, performances, and other exhibits offensive to public morality shall be prohibited. Measures of preventive and repressive measure against such violations shall be established by law. Nazi Germany. In 1933 freedom of the press was suppressed in Hitler's Germany by the Reichstag fire decree of President Paul von Hindenburg, just as Adolf Hitler was coming to power. Hitler largely suppressed freedom of the press through Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. As the ministry's name implies, propaganda did not carry the negative connotations that it does today. How-to manuals were openly distributed by that same ministry explaining the craft of effective propaganda. The ministry also acted as a central control point for all media, issuing orders as to what stories could be run and what stories would be suppressed. Anyone involved in the film industry from directors to the lowliest assistant had to sign an oath of loyalty to the Nazi Party, due to opinion-changing power Goebbels perceived movies to have. Journalists who crossed the propaganda ministry were routinely imprisoned or shot as traitors. The Sicherheitsdienst and other Nazi police organizations also created a network of internal, domestic spying, so that for example, the White Rose Society was in constant fear of discovery and execution. Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Freedom of press laws were first passed in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1539. Sweden. One of the world's first freedom of the press acts was introduced in Sweden in 1766, mainly due to classical liberal Member of Parliament Anders Chydenius. Accepted and liable to prosecution was only vocal opposition to the King and the Church of Sweden. The act was largely rolled back after King Gustav's coup d'état Copyright Act in 1772, restored after the overthrowing of his son, Gustav IV of Sweden in 1809, and fully recognized with the abolishment of the king's prerogative to cancel licenses in the 1840s. Asia, India. The Indian constitution, while not mentioning the word press, provides for the right to freedom of speech and expression. However, this right is subject to restrictions under sub-clause, whereby this freedom can be restricted for reasons of sovereignty and integrity of India, the security of the state, friendly relations with foreign states, public order, preserving decency, preserving morality, in relation to contempt, court, defamation, or incitement to an offence. Laws such as the Official Secrets Act and Prevention of Terrorist Activities Act have been used to limit press freedom. Under POTA, person could be detained for up to 6 months for being in contact with a terrorist or terrorist group. POTA was repealed in 2006, but the Official Secrets Act 1923 continues. For the first half-century of independence, media control by the state was the major constraint on press freedom. Indira Gandhi famously stated in 1975 that All India Radio is a government organ, it is going to remain a government organ. With the liberalisation starting in the 1990s, private control of media has burgeoned, leading to increasing independence and greater scrutiny of government. It ranks poorly at 140th rank out of 179 listed countries in the Press Freedom Index 2013 released by Reporters Without Borders. Analytically, India's press freedom, as could be deduced by the Press Freedom Index, has constantly reduced since 2002, when it culminated in terms of apparent freedom, achieving a rank of 80 among the reported countries. Implications of new technologies. Many of the traditional means of delivering information are being slowly superseded by the increasing pace of modern technological advance. Almost every conventional mode of media and information dissemination has a modern counterpart that offers significant potential advantages to journalists seeking to maintain and enhance their freedom of speech. A few simple examples of such phenomena include satellite television versus terrestrial television. Whilst terrestrial television is relatively easy to manage and manipulate, satellite television is much more difficult to control as journalistic content can easily be broadcast from other jurisdictions beyond the control of individual governments. An example of this in the Middle East is the satellite broadcaster Al-Jazeera. This Arabic-language media channel operates out of Qatar, whose government is relatively liberal with respect to many of its neighboring states. As such, its views and content are often problematic to a number of governments in the region and beyond. However, because of the increased affordability and miniaturization of satellite technology, it is simply not practicable for most states to control popular access to the channel. Web-based publishing versus traditional publishing. Traditional magazines and newspapers rely on physical resources that can easily be targeted and forced to close down. Web-based publishing systems can be run using ubiquitous and inexpensive equipment and can operate from any global jurisdiction. To get control over web publications, nations and organizations are using geolocation and geolocation software. Voice over Internet Protocol versus conventional telephony. Although conventional telephony systems are easily tapped and recorded, modern VoIP technology can employ low-cost strong cryptography to evade surveillance. As VoIP and similar technologies become more widespread, they are likely to make the effective monitoring of journalists a very difficult task for governments. Naturally, Governments are responding to the challenges posed by new media technologies by deploying increasingly sophisticated technology of their own, but it seems that this will become an increasingly difficult task as journalists continue to find new ways to exploit technology and stay one step ahead of the generally slower-moving government institutions that attempt to censor them. In May 2010, U.S. President Barack Obama signed legislation intended to promote a free press around the world, a bipartisan measure inspired by the murder in Pakistan of Daniel Pearl, the Wall Street Journal reporter, shortly after the September 11 attacks in 2001. The legislation, called the Daniel Pearl Freedom of the Press Act, requires the United States Department of State to expand its scrutiny of news media restrictions and intimidation as part of its annual review of human rights in each country. In 2012, the Obama administration collected communication records from 20 separate home and office lines for Associated Press reporters over a 2-month period, possibly in an effort to curtail government leaks to the press. The surveillance caused widespread condemnation by First Amendment experts and free press advocates, and led 50 major media organizations to sign and send a letter of protest to American Attorney General Eric Holder. Past sources: the Napoleonic Code lists freedom of speech, that is the freedom to protect oneself from being quieted by those seeking to prevent exposure, especially in court, as one of the rights of man. Freedom of motion is another. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted by the United Nations in 1948, repeats this. The ancient Greeks and Romans had no law against press, and their rules of equity established what legal speech should be allowed to be argued in court by either litigant. U.S. law still prohibits any valid motion from being quieted, though some complain of being quieted in U.S. courtrooms still. Organizations for press freedom. See also. Notes. References: Paul. The Creation of the Media, Political Origins of Modern Communications. New York, Basic Books. ISBN A0-465-08193-2. Gant, Scott. We're All Journalists Now, The Transformation of the Press and Reshaping of the Law in the Internet Age. New York, Free Press. ISBN A0-7432-9926-4. Thyra, Adam and Brian Anderson. A Manifesto for Media Freedom. New York, Encounter Books. ISBN A1-59403-228-9. Week, Jar 1/4 GEN. Censorship and Freedom of the Press. Leibniz Institute of European History. External links. Resources publish and translate articles of independent journalists, The Activist magazine, Paradox of Media Freedom in Pakistan, Southeast Europe Media Organization, Band magazine, The Journal of Censorship and Secrecy. News and Free Speech, a Euro newspaper index blog, Press Freedom, OSCE representative on freedom of the media, MANA Euro the Media Alliance for New Activism, International Freedom of Expression Exchange, a Euro monitors press freedom around the world, IPS Interpress Service, independent news on press freedom around the world, the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, Reporters Without Borders, Doha Center for Media Freedom, World Press Freedom Committee, Student Press Law Center, Unions Syndicale des Journalistes CFDT.